Hey folks, Professor Finn here, and today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7 of Ralph Klicker's Funeral Service Psychology and Counseling. Let's go ahead and get the presentation up, and let's talk about complicated grief. So complicated grief, as known as pathologic, chronic, delayed, masked, or exaggerated grief. This is someplace where I disagree with this textbook. Those are not that is not complicated grief. Those are types of complicated grief. So I don't view this as an alias. I view those as subtypes. So be careful. They're not just AKAs, but they're their own subcategories. Complicated grief, by definition, is more intense than normal grief, yet different than clinical depression. So chronic grief is a reaction that is prolonged, excessive in duration, and never comes to a satisfactory conclusion. Delayed grief, also known as inhibited, suppressed, or postponed grief, is a reaction that does not occur in a normal time frame, but occurs at a later time. So chronic grief, you have grief, it is excessive in duration, it is prolonged, and you never really resolve it. So this is normal grief that should have come to an end but hasn't. Delayed grief is the reaction occurs sometime in the future, and it just comes out kind of nowhere. Masked grief occurs when a person experiences symptoms and behavior which causes them difficulty, but they don't recognize the fact that this is part of their grief reaction. They attribute it to something else. Exaggerated grief occurs when the reactions to the loss are excessive and disabling. So you are having a grief reaction and it is over the top. You have disenfranchised grief, which is coined by Kenneth Doka. This is a loss that society believes does not deserve mourning. The loss is not openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly shared. So we talked about homicide in a previous chapter. Every one of the serial killers that has murdered someone, that has been someone's spouse, someone's child, someone's brother, someone's something. And what happens when that person dies? We have disenfranchised grief. How does Ted Bundy's mother mourn her child? How do his cousins or his siblings, because I don't remember what his extended family is like, mourn that individual knowing that they are that they're a serial killer? That would be something along the lines of disenfranchised grief. And that is not just limited to serial killers by any stretch of the imagination, but any marginalized group of people that communities just kind of turn a blind eye to. How do you recognize that loss? This was very prevalent in gay communities before the type of modern acceptance that we have here in the 2020s. I know some people may argue that we really don't have acceptance. I know damn well what it was like in the 80s, and it is a lot different now than it was 40 years ago. I promise you that. So there is a more recognized situation when it comes to the loss of partners, especially with the advent of Obergefell versus Hodges, with legalized marriage between same-sex partners. So there are still pockets of the community for certain in the United States, and I am not naive or delusional, that if a person is in a committed relationship with a same-sex partner, that if that partner passes away, that likely they may not be able to grieve them because the community does not approve of their union. That would be an example of disenfranchised grief. So in general, 2.5 million die annually, which leaves behind an average of 5 grieving survivors. More than 1 million people develop complicated grief each year. So disenfranchised grief. 4 types of death can lead to this type of grief. The relationship is not socially recognized. So homosexual relationships, extramarital relationships, heterosexual cohabitation outside of marriage, because that is still a thing. Loss is not acknowledged by others as being genuine. Abortion, miscarriage, pet loss, death of a former spouse. Grievers are unrecognized. Death of a friend, coworkers, or someone mentally disabled. And death is not socially sanctioned. Suicide, autoerotic asphyxia, or legal execution. The grief response is further intensified because there is a lack of the normally expected support. Complicating factors, relationship factors, ambivalence, things of that nature, circumstantial factors, uncertainty, multiple losses, sudden death, traumatic death, shocking, horrific death, everything we basically talked about in a previous chapter. There are personality factors, inability to tolerate extreme emotional issues or negative self-concepts. Shame, embarrassment, social stigma, no strong social support group. These are all social factors that can complicate grief. Historical factors, previous complicated grief, influence of early parental loss. Complicated grief can develop physical symptoms, suicide, substance abuse, or even heart disease. Again, back to Bowlby. Grief takes a toll on your body. Your mind has an amazing ability to influence the physical condition of your body. 15 to 20% of mourners will have their grief turn into complicated grief. Now, what is the appearance of this nasty thing? Well, the unfortunate truth is this varies with the individual and the situation. But to be true complicated grief, the person must have experienced symptoms for a significant period of time, a minimum of several months. They are unable to move forward toward recovery or make adjustments to accept the reality of loss. So what are some possible symptoms? The appearance of this stuff: difficulty speaking to the deceased without or speaking about the deceased without experiencing renewed and intense grief. They constantly bring up themes of death and loss in even the most casual conversations, ongoing sleep problems for more than 6 weeks, and sudden radical changes to their lifestyle. They could exhibit self-destructive behavior, develop the same symptoms the deceased had without any medical issues, and have a continued disability in the death. They have an inability to accept the death, persistent nightmares, flashbacks, and/or intrusive memories, and magnified and prolonged grief symptoms. Maintenance of a fantasy relationship with the deceased with feelings the deceased is always present and watching could also mean talking to the deceased. Continuous yearning and searching for the deceased, unusual symptoms that seem to be unrelated to the death, and breaking off all ties to social contacts. They avoid anything associated with the deceased. Friend, family, shared activities. Minor events trigger major grief responses. They exhibit consistent symptoms of depression, extreme guilt, hopelessness, and lowered self-esteem. They have an ability, their ability to manage everyday responsibilities at work, school, or home is significantly impaired. And in order to fix this, they've kind of figured out new ways of getting people involved. So the first thing is the patient has to start where it began. They have to revisit the death. And then the patient resumes pleasurable activities and social contacts, seeing that kind of you're acknowledging the reality of the death and you're building in very slowly normal things that you used to do. This type of research is based on a concept that you resolve your grief as you move on with your life rather than resolving your grief and then moving on. And that is practical wisdom for normal grief as well. You do not resolve your grief and move on with your life. You live as you are resolving your grief. Patients are urged to retell the story of the death because the more you talk about it, the more you express your emotions, the more you're able to grow accustomed to it. Produce an audio recording of their story and listen to it repeatedly to reduce their aversion to talking or thinking about it. Patients also participate in an imagined conversation with the person they have lost, speaking openly about shared experiences. Doctors also urge patients to re-engage the world in normal activities. These are important findings because complicated grievers have difficulty finding help for their problems because they look physiologically sound. It is a mental health issue, and people have a stigma with visiting a mental health professional to get the help they need. This is why it is important as a funeral practitioner that you know what the free resources are in your communities, grief circles, etc., that you can refer people to where they can at least have access to grief facilitators, and in some cases, this also gets them some access to licensed mental health professionals that they can meet with to help them process what is going on. Folks, that concludes this lecture. We will see you next time.